I wanted to ask a question of you, Ms Jenkins, in the context of some of the questions that were asked a little bit earlier by Senator Waters about recent reports that have been produced in the context of universities trying to do all they can to eradicate sexual assault and harassment. A cause which is, of course, very worthy. I wouldn't want my questions to be regarded as anything but that. What I wanted to ask, though, is have you read the report that TEXA has prepared called Report to the Minister for Education, Higher Education Sector Response to the Issue of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment?
Is that the one from January this year?
Yes, that's the one.
Yes.
Has it factored into the work that you've been doing, or did you work with TEXA in helping them prepare that?
The other way round. So TEXA took the information in that report was taken from our website.
So it was about implementing your work in a practical sense?
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
In that report, and I'm looking at around about page 8, there's a section that's about what are the appropriate procedures for responding to somebody who makes an allegation that they have experienced this kind of conduct. And it quite rightly goes through a whole lot of steps to take to protect the well-being of a person who is making an allegation of experiencing that kind of harm, how you care for their safety, how you make sure that they get access to security and so forth, and all of that makes sense to me. What concerns me about the report, though, is that there's no section that provides for the proper way of investigating these types of concerns in a way that both protects the rights of the person making the allegation and ensures appropriate standards of proof and natural justice to make sure both that findings have an intellectual rigour that means they are respected and that makes sure we are getting these calls right, that we're not, badging somebody unfairly or in circumstances where there's insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. Did that aspect, the investigatory and university discipline and enforcement aspect, come into your work that fed into the TEXA report?
Okay, so I can't speak on behalf of TEXA. The system in terms of how it works is they're the agency that considers the university as part of the government relationship.
Yep.
And at the point that we did our research, TEXA had not particularly focused on sexual harassment and sexual assault in universities. So when it was looking at its funding model and whether the universities met the standards that they might set, this was not one of the factors that was a high priority. I'm not sure where it's at.
Okay.
When we did our piece of work, so your concern about TEXA I can't answer.
That's okay. I'm more interested in the underlying work you did that fed into TEXA's work.
And the question is a really good one because this is... if I combine the university work with the workplace sexual harassment inquiry, the same issues apply, even though the university work was focused on students. So what did come up through the university survey and the submission process, so we got over 1,800 submissions in that, was the frustration about the responses by universities, including investigations. Primarily the complaints were people who'd made complaints, but we also know and had heard about fears about lack of natural justice, how the response was dealt with. So our recommendations broadly were, when it was about responses, it included about what is an appropriate and safe way, not simply about victim focus, also about how do you handle complaints and bring them to a conclusion. So my comment to you would be, what you've raised is absolutely a serious concern. And I think historically, and universities are no different, but corporates and universities, this issue's really been one that has been in the hands, when a complaint comes up, it goes into the hands of lawyers. And I think a few people here would be supportive of lawyers, including the chair. But actually, it then, what we've heard through the inquiry is it then spirals into a major adversarial and kind of, major investigation. So I think actually what I've heard is the victims find that very stressful, the people accused find it very stressful and feel like it's not fair, and actually the organisations find that it takes up their resources and it sort of spirals out of control. So some of what I would say in response to what you're saying, and the Human Rights Commission has over time really given guidance on how do you deal with complaints, and recognising our industrial laws and unfair dismissal laws and all those things, is that we need a new model that doesn't go straight from here's an issue to can we sack this person, should this person, that sort of goes towards misconduct rather than resolving. So part of my answer to you is I don't think it's as simple as saying we need better legal processes to make sure it works out that you get the right outcome. Still seeking justice, what you're looking for is an appropriate response that doesn't do more harm than good, and a proportionate response to the nature of the issue. So I'm not sure, in terms of the report from TEXA, their focus, which I really welcome, is to be another voice saying universities, we're watching, we care what you're doing. But this conversation, and generally, I know universities have had historically quite a legal response, and I don't think a more legal response is necessarily actually the objective, but an understanding of what are the different responses. But keeping the fairness and the natural justice and the focus on the welfare of everyone continues to be important.
Yeah. Look, I accept what you've got to say about it being fraught. It's a really, really hard issue to get right, and you're also right to say one size doesn't necessarily always fit all. There'll be some things that are smaller and, I guess, reconcilable in a simpler way, and a bit of a spectrum to ones that might necessitate a legalistic approach. Though if I were to observe the approach of universities so far, I'd probably make the opposite observation, that is to say it hasn't been legally rigorous enough in many ways. There has been, in many ways, a well-meaning attempt to approach it pastorally in relation to victims, but in circumstances where a person who faces an allegation can face consequences that rival the consequences of a criminal prosecution, in the sense that they would lose their reputation, lose their ability to join whatever profession they're training for, potentially lose their ability to get a degree, lose their ability to earn an income. And these are all really big consequences. And at the moment we've got a system where these things aren't being determined beyond reasonable doubt. In many cases, they're not even clearly being determined on the balance of probabilities. There's no requirement of adducing evidence and no opportunity provided for a person to clearly have a right to contest the evidence against them by calling witnesses of their own. I could go for a long time about a number of the concerns that I've got. Most universities seem to do a fairly good job of giving notice of the adverse case against a person who's accused, and they make something of an effort to allow a person to reply to the adverse case, though the execution is a little mixed. But even in a civil case where you're dealing with a really serious allegation, that Brigginshaw standard says the more serious the allegation is, the higher the standard to which you've got to prove it. And we don't have that operating in universities at the moment either. We don't seem to have a clear presumption of innocence. Indeed, much of the pastoral approach that's being adopted means it's probably the opposite. Again, not in an ill-intentioned way, but just as a consequence of an attempt to be as helpful as is possible to people who have experienced terrible things. There's no general right of appeal in most cases. There's no right to be legally represented when being interviewed for these sorts of things. And there's no sort of internal independence of the process by which a person is dealt with according to these procedures. And so with that in mind, what do you think is necessary to ensure that we get the balance right in ensuring we are dealing with incidents sensitively and seriously, because they can't be trivialised, whilst at the same time protecting the rights of people who are unfairly accused or for whom the evidence might take a different colour to the form in which it's alleged?
So my comment would be, I've just spent sort of 18 months on a national inquiry considering this, and I don't for 1 minute suggest that there isn't an important role for a proper process that should be fair to everyone. And so I take on board your comments. I also take on board that the majority of people never raise complaints, including victims of sexual assault. So I would say broadly the system isn't working for most people, whichever side of this equation, and that it has been really important. So the National Inquiry really does have, in terms of the workplace, really a section saying, okay, what would be lower level options, but if it is serious enough, what's an appropriate response, which I think would go to your concerns. It has definitely come up in the conversations, and having been an employment lawyer for 20 years, I do know that it feels like it's got worse and worse over time rather than better and better, and I don't think that was anyone's intent. So I think now's a good time to reconsider. But yeah, my response is I hear what you're saying in terms of the concerns. I'm perhaps, I've come from a point of being a very committed employment lawyer to realising sometimes going more legal actually hasn't helped us. But that's not to say you absolutely shouldn't recognise everyone's rights in those processes. And it really does bother me actually that public reputational damage harms everyone disproportionately to the incidents, and I hope I can help change that narrative and that conversation.
So the work you're doing now is looking closely at how to resolve these matters?
Yes.
Beautiful. That's very encouraging. Thank you.